I'd like to introduce Kate Raworth. She's known for her donut economics, and the key thing is she defines a little bit the safe operating space, and she wants to lead us into it. So without little more ado, I'll hand over to Kate Raworth, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join all of you. Really important conference that we're going to have, and a discussion in a very critical moment, a very critical Monday morning for the world, I think, given the results of the US election. It definitely means that possibilities are opening that otherwise would have been closed. So let's see how that looks from a perspective of Europe. So I want to share some slides this morning so that I can tell the story together with those slides. I can't yet see those slides. If they could be made visible for me, that would be excellent. Thank you. So Europe's Green Deal. First of all, I have to just acknowledge that I am a British citizen, and I am extremely sorry and devastated that my country is on the outside of this. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm someone seeing what's happening in the European region, and I congratulate Europe on moving forward in a way that no other region has started to do. But will this Green Deal be harnessed for the transformation that we already knew was needed, or will it be hijacked by vested interests and business as usual? That, of course, has to be a critical question. So I want to start just by pulling right back by looking at the big picture of where we are in these days of the 21st century. Because this century has begun with repeated crises. 2008 gave us financial meltdown. We are living in an era of climate and ecological breakdown. And now countries around the world, across Europe and everywhere, are enduring COVID lockdown. And these crises emerge from the very systems that we've been creating. They emerge from the endless expansionism of human systems, whether it's the endless expansion of the financial system, the endless expansion of humanity's use of energy and fossil resources, or indeed humanity's travel and expansion into wild areas. Our strategy of endlessly expanding means that there are boomerang effects that hit back on us and undermine the very sources of our well-being. And so we need to reimagine what prosperity looks like. And so for this, I offer you a donut. Imagine humanity's well-being thriving in that green circle, leaving no one falling short on the essentials of life without the food and water, healthcare, political voice, housing that every person has a claim to, but also not overshooting that ecological ceiling, the 9 planetary boundaries that are Earth's life-supporting systems that make this the one habitable planet that we know of in the entire universe. So we need to find a balance where we can meet the needs of all people within the means of this living planet. But if balance is where we want to get to, we're very far from that now. If we go through, keep going to the next, we'll see we are in massive overshoot. Falling short on meeting people's essential needs, we need to eliminate all of the red from the middle of that picture so that no person worldwide is left falling short on the essentials of life. But we have to do that globally in a context where we are already overshooting multiple planetary boundaries. We know we are in overshoot on climate change, but also on fertilizer use, on land conversion, on catastrophic levels of biodiversity loss that are breaking down the web of life. This is a global picture of humanity as a whole, but at the national level, we can see the story is very different for very different countries. So on the left-hand side, you have Rwanda, very strongly falling short on meeting its people's needs, but without overshooting any of those planetary boundaries. In the middle, we have China, both falling short significantly on meeting people's needs, but already overshooting planetary boundaries. And then on the far right, we have Australia. Relative to most countries in the world, it is meeting people's needs. This is a low global social bar, but it is massively an overshoot on its impact on planetary boundaries. And if we want to see where Europe is, well, yes, Europe, like Australia, is almost meeting its people's needs and massively in overshoot. By the way, this is the story for all high-income countries, because that ecological overshoot is not just the resources used within the land mass of Europe or Australia or the United States. It's the consumption-based use of the world's material footprint, fossil fuel emissions, water, land, the worldwide consumption, and it has to come back within. This is our generational challenge to transform this. Now, if we take a look at 150 countries worldwide, all on this scatter plot, the sweet spot is that top left-hand corner, where we meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And for me, this just tells us that we are all developing countries now. I have never encountered a single country in the world that can say, we're developed. Because there is no country that on this 21st century vision of what it means to be developed and have prosperity, no country is close. Every country needs an unprecedented transformation. And that means we need a phenomenal humility and unparalleled ambition. Now, Europe within this story is in the high income, high overshoot countries, all of those red dots that I've picked out. And of course, Europe has put forward the Green Deal. To me, the Green Deal's test is it going to bring Europe into that sweet spot that Europe is meeting the needs of all of its people within the means of planetary boundaries? And so the European Green Deal, it's been in practice for 1 year. We know it has a diversity of ambitions. It brings social transition and just transition in alongside a transformative green agenda. But what does it actually look like in practice? Will it be harnessed for the transformation we already knew was needed? Or will it be hijacked by interests that are long-standing and that will try to undermine transformation because it doesn't serve their vested needs? So I want to look at this from 3 perspectives. The vision and the leadership that's set out, which inspires and is set in words and in speeches and in text. What does that look like when it then comes down to the specifics of the target set and the strategy? And then when we get really serious, when the rubber hits the road, as they say, when we get down to the action, what does it look like when it's translated into legislation and finance? Follow the law and follow the money. So let me start at the top, the vision and leadership. First, we cannot deny that Europe has set out a transformative agenda with a broad vision across sectors, with social just transition written in alongside the Green Deal. It's leadership. And for that, Europe has to be recognized and praised for having that leadership. It's continued to hold that through the COVID crisis, and indeed recognize that every now and then a crack opens up in history and a moment opens up when you can make transformation happen. And the COVID crisis has to be one of those moments. And so to use the Green Deal as a vision for a green and just recovery from COVID is, again, strong, impressive leadership. When I read the texts, what I'm struck by, however, is the desire to hold together 2 quite different paradigms. There's the old paradigm of growth, and it's presented as a new growth strategy, but this is the shape of growth, right? Endless shoot, exponential growth, rising forever, going through the ceiling, up, up, up. And the notion that countries succeed by growing endlessly is a deeply rooted one. Deeply rooted, I say, almost 100 years. It's been around, the idea that economic success looks like endless GDP growth. And that's written into the strategy. But it also sits there with a much more holistic vision. I'm going to hold up the donut here. A much more holistic vision of thriving in balance. And that language, there's the idea of generative growth is put forward in the Green Deal. Now, to me, generative growth is trying to have the donut and endless growth at the same time. So these words need to be made to mean something. The commitment to planetary boundaries within some of the texts is crucial because they begin to connect us to the laws of planet Earth and what makes this planet succeed. But how? Drive for growth and a recognition of planetary boundaries and a desire to be generative, how those are actually brought together in practice means everything. So let's go down to the next level of what this looks like when we hit the target and the strategy. First of all, let's start off looking at climate change. We have to recognize that 2050 is too slow, too late for the world's highest income, most ambitious, most historically responsible country to think that that is an adequate time by which to go net carbon zero. it does not live up to the science or to this moment in history. I find it quite bizarre, actually, and I'm not talking just about Europe now, but all high-income countries that think the idea for them to arrive at net zero by 2050, it's like saying we want to be the fastest in the race, but I'm willing to hit the finish line at the time of the last qualifier. It's completely inadequate, and we need much more ambition again by 2030, not 55%, more like 65%, to show that transition is serious. Second, on circularity in the circular economy plan and decoupling. If Europe wants to marry living within planetary boundaries with economic growth, then decoupling is not just a nice to have, it's the essential, it's everything, it's the heart of the matter. Without it, nothing. So there are no adequate binding targets on decoupling being expressed in the circular economy plan. And that means that Europe does not have its eye on the strength of decoupling required if it really believes it's going to meet growth within planetary boundaries. So this has to be rectified. The decoupling, and I'm not just talking about relative decoupling or a little bit of absolute decoupling, I'm talking about sufficient absolute decoupling that brings down Europe's resource use, material footprint, speed and scale that's required. It's unprecedented. So this is a deeply transformative journey that needs targets and strategy to make it happen and to ensure that it's happening. Lastly, on targets and strategy, there's a real concern that Europe is ensuring its consumption is reduced and its environmental impacts are reduced within the area of Europe without having its eye on what's happening overseas. And I want to come to the question of agriculture, because although Europe's farm to fork strategy has some good progress on fertilizers and pesticides and organic and tree planting and protecting rivers, it doesn't have the equivalent eye ensuring that imports of agricultural produce are under stringent challenges as well to become far greened. Europe imports a fifth of its crops and 2/3 of its meat and dairy. And between 1990 and 2014, while Europe increased hectarage of forest by about 30 million hectares, at the same time, 11 million hectares were being deforested in countries like Brazil and Indonesia for food products that were imported into Europe. So it cannot be a swap of biodiversity here and loss there. We have to take a global and planetary perspective on environmental and agricultural impacts. So let me come down from targets and strategy now down to the bottom, which is to law and money, the legislation and the finance. And this is where the risk of hijack becomes very, very real. And this is where I have some serious alerts. So first of all, the Common Agricultural Policy, as we know, it was drawn up under a previous commission. It is not compatible or compliant with the Green Deal. So what's going to happen? If that Common Agricultural Policy goes through, that's proof at the first hurdle that this is a case of hijack. It has to be taken off the table and retabled as a proposition that is compatible with the vision and the ambition of the Green Deal. So we need that transformation. Second, on the Recovery and the Resilience Fund facility, it's important that a large percentage, around 37%, at least 37% of that money is dedicated to green investment projects, but it also has to be sure that none of that money goes into fossil fuels, and all of that money does no harm in accord with the principles of the Green Deal and the EU taxonomy. So how that money gets spent, what projects the member states put forward, what the Commission agrees to, and how that gets spent will be the first evidence of the Green Deal on the ground, in legislation and in impact. And then the last point I want to raise is about the binding nature of the Green Deal's ambition and commitment at the level of member states. Will member states adopt this? And what happens if they don't? What happens if they don't follow through on what Europe knows needs to happen? And I want to add that it's crucial that the design of business and finance is reshaped to make this possible. So Europe's Sustainable Finance Plan is really important to keep pushing ahead in the direction it's going. And then the Sustainable Corporate Governance Plan coming next year is very, very important to bring along business. I spend time talking with major companies that know they need to transform, but know that they need the transformative legislative framework in which they can make that move. So all of this needs to happen together. So let me go to the final image I want to share, and I want just to come back to the picture. Can I just see the slides as well, please? I would like to show the picture of where will Europe be in 2030? In 10 years' time, where will we be? I'm just about to turn 50 years old. So in 10 years' time, I'll be 60. My kids will have left home. I want you to think, where will you be in 10 years' time? What will have happened to this picture over these 10 years? Because where Europe's nations are and where Europe is as a whole and what the Green Deal turned out to be depends absolutely on the actions, the legislation, the finance, the choices that underpin the fine words right now. Who do we want to have been over this decade that's just beginning? This has been one hell of a start of it this year. Let us leave this year in the past and move forward in a far more transformative way. But who do we want to have been? Who do we want our jobs, our roles, the commissions that we're part of, the companies, institutions, the NGOs, the governments that we represent? Will we enable ourselves to look back in 10 years' time and say, yes, we actually turned that corner. We began to put those fine words, decades of fine words, we began to make them real. This agenda of the Green Deal has the capacity, has the potential in it to be harnessed for that future. It also, as I'm sure everybody in this webinar knows, it has a very clear potential to be hijacked by business as usual, Europe as usual, vested interests that have no vision about transformation. Let us make sure it turns the corner that needs to be turned, and that as Europe emerges from this emergency of COVID, it pursues the agenda and it pursues the future it already knew that we needed. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kate. That was inspirational. What we'll do now is we've got had a poll in the beginning. We'll have a series of questions, so get your questions in for Kate. But I'll kick off with a couple of myself while you're getting your questions in. Well, first of all, a quick comment. Thank you very much for the speech. We wanted a visionary and you gave us a visionary, so thank you. We wanted a way into a safe operating space and you gave us that as well. A couple of takeaways for me is you mentioned several times the sort of unparalleled ambition is needed. You also mentioned repeatedly the issue of that the program could be harnessed or hijacked. You mentioned this is a moment in history and we need to turn the corner. So, and you also mentioned the issue of just transition. So I've got two questions to kick off. One is, I mean, we in the environmental community focus, of course, on the green aspects of the Green Deal, but we try hard to make sure that the social dimension is fully integrated. You mentioned the just transition, so I wouldn't mind hearing a little bit more what you think the Green Deal needs to do to ensure that the social dimension is adequately integrated.
Yeah, a lot of the transformation that needs to happen, let's just say in the space of energy and energy efficiency, investing in energy efficiency of households, insulating homes, insulating buildings. It is a retrofit job that needs to happen street upon street upon street upon street across Europe. And that is labor intensive, semi-skilled and skilled work. And that creates jobs in localities because it's work that has to be done everywhere. So it's a really clear example of a win-win for reskilling people, creating jobs that have purpose towards green transformation. And then on circularity, create a circular economy. This is an economy in which resources are not used up, they're used again and again, far more carefully, more collectively, more slowly, and more creatively. And again, that creates jobs in terms of material reuse, refurbishing, reprocessing, remanufacturing, and it creates jobs locally. It takes us away from these very extractive, globalized supply chains and creates a far more distributed, localized economy. But that needs investment to make sure that there is a circular program of materials reuse and these different levels. So I see a lot of potential for creating employment through circularity, through energy efficiency. And also, if we begin thinking about greening buildings and bringing greenery into cities, that's what the biomimicry thinker Janine Benyus would call high-touch work, where material and greenery and trees and plants need care, they need maintenance, and that's a human connection with the living world in urban centers. So there are many different ways of creating jobs in this transformation. And I think it's crucial to focus on the new jobs that are being created. And of course, we've seen across the United States and across Europe now that the number of jobs in renewable and clean and efficiency and the green agenda are outstripping the old jobs left behind in the fossil fuel industry. So it's crucial to create those new jobs, but also to ensure a just transition for those who need reskilling, and to ensure that, as the European Green Deal itself says, no one is left behind, to ensure that this does not become a process of greater inequality. It absolutely need not be. Those investments need to be made to bring all communities along and to center opportunity in localities so that people aren't forced into large major industrial centers, but there is enterprise in rural, in towns and in villages so that people can work where they live and have that sense of local community. So I think there's huge opportunity to put the green agenda together with a far more transformative social agenda. And I'm so glad that it's written into the Green Deal. It has to therefore be made real at every step.
Okay, thank you very much. I've now got a question from the floor. Raoul Pop asks, we need member states to take a stronger climate leadership. How do we do that? So this is the issue of, at the moment, we've got at the European level a commitment which is being discussed of minus 55%, for at least minus 55 for 2030. How can we get the leadership in the member states on the climate? Because the more leadership in the member state, the easier it is to have a European ambition too.
Yes. So like you, I am searching for that. We are all searching. This is a big teamwork that many actors trying to bring about this transformation together. What I see is the pressure of Fridays for Future. I see in some countries pressure from Extinction Rebellion and from activists who have, some people say they've gone too far and they're too radical, but my goodness, they've pulled the window. They've pulled the window of what's normal and what can be expected, and they have moved governments and moved what's normal. And it's an undoubtedly essential force that's made positive change. So for me, it's the continual mobilization of Europe's citizens calling not for what seems feasible or practical or politically viable, but for what's necessary. And then it is leadership from within those states. In the work I'm doing, I'm, as so many people also will see, it's the leadership of one that creates peer-to-peer inspiration for others. I think we're seeing Europe providing that leadership. Europe was the first region of countries to come out and say in law net zero by 2050, and we're seeing others, China, Japan, Korea. Let's see what the US does now. But also within Europe and the member states, when one member state steps up and actually sets a more ambitious target, as some have done, I believe this will provide inspiration for others to realize that 2050 is just far too slow and doesn't sit with the ambition and leadership that Europe holds.
Okay,
and sorry, let me add that. No, I'm not just talking about 2050, it's about 2030, that additional ambition. I mean, we will look back and realize that those who set higher ambitions for themselves in many ways made it easier for themselves, because once you set a high ambition, everybody knows that we're transforming. The message is clear, the information's out there, the signal is long, it's legal, and it's loud. Now let's just get going. When you set a less ambitious goal, a lot of energy from companies goes into lobbying. Can we be the ones who are the exception? Do we really have to try this hard? So actually a more ambitious goal sends a clearer, firmer signal and just actually makes it easier to make the transformation in the end.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd just like to build on that, and then I've got another question, but to build on that, you mentioned that we had China, we had Japan, we had Korea also committing to carbon neutrality, China for 2060, Korea and Japan the last couple of weeks for 2050. Do you think there's space and opportunity for the EU to export its Green Deal model to other countries? Is there space for a global diplomacy?
I don't think Europe should try to export the Green Deal, because I don't think Europe would want to import a policy from somewhere else. I think policies and visions need to be from that place. But I think what Europe can do is provide the inspiration and the leadership and the pace that's needed. So I think whether it comes up by the name of Green Deal, doesn't matter whether something's called a Green Deal or not. What matters is that it has the vision of bringing humanity within planetary boundaries so that we protect the life-supporting systems of this planet, and that we do it in a way that's just for all of humanity. Whatever countries want to call that, when we see the policies, we will know whether or not they're aligned with that. and whether or not they're escaping that long draw of 20th century endless economic growth. That's a really dangerous trap to get caught in, thinking everything has to be framed as endless economic growth. We have much, much clearer metrics now of what human prosperity depends upon, and it depends upon the stability of a thriving planet. And we can measure that in the planet's own terms. So let's put that first, because without that, nothing. We destroy the living systems on which we depend. So I want to see other regions, countries, whether they're small or whether they're massive global players, they all provide inspiration of showing that paradigm change is possible. And it's possible not just in terms of civil society leadership, it's possible in terms of governmental leadership.
Okay, no, thanks very much. So Europe should lead by example, and also engage interestedly between different regions to look at the diversity of solutions as well, because maybe we can be inspired by successes. I've got now a question in terms of leading by example, and Sophie asks something on the Common Agricultural Policy. You yourself mentioned that the CAP is running counter the objectives of the Green Deal. So do you see either a need or an opportunity for the CAP to actually be taken off the table, for the Commission to withdraw it and put a new one which is Green Deal compatible on the table? At the moment, both the Parliament and Council are entering the trilogues, but with the proposals that are not ambitious enough. Should Europe have the courage to try again with the CAP?
So Europe has to have the courage to say, if we're going to come in with the first piece of legislation under President von der Leyen's Commission is the Green Deal, and it is the framing piece of legislation. She made it very clear that this was the umbrella under which everything would follow, and this has been the umbrella under which all of COVID has been managed. And then an old version of the Common Agricultural Policy negotiation is brought in, and it's not compatible with the new vision that's been set. This is the moment when push comes to shove. This is the moment when the rubber hits the road, when we find out where the vision actually follows through in action. So of course, it has to be made compatible. Now, I'm not sitting on the inside of European processes, so it's not for me to say exactly how and in what process, but it's quite clear as somebody, a passionate friend of Europe, watching from the outside, who worked for many years on the Common Agricultural Policy in my role at Oxfam, this needs to change. Either transformation happens or it doesn't. Either we harness this moment for the future we want, or we get hijacked by the past. And we know that the Common Agricultural Policy has always had strong vested interests that have made it an outlier on European progressive policy. This is the moment to decide and show whether or not the Green Deal is Europe's vision, or whether it's going to be watered down and co-opted and eased off to make way for vested interests that are too strong to be changed.
Thank you very much. I've now got another question which builds on the CAP but goes further. But first of all, we can be pleased that we have a new proposed government in the States. But with that comes the prospect of maybe a trade deal, because CETA was off the table in the last presidency, but now it may come on the table. So you mentioned that the CAP contradicts the goal of the Green Deal, but what about big trade deals like the CETA or the EU-Mercosur? Can they be made compatible with in bringing the EU's economy into the donut? So what needs to be done?
So they do need to be made compatible. And I'm not going to dive into the details of those agreements and those trade possibilities, but just want to stand back and say trade has to be made compatible with the vision of our time. And the dangers of our international institutions, whether we have the WTO or the World Intellectual Property Organization or the World Bank or the IMF, we have these institutions, we can very quickly get caught in what's already going on in these institutions, and we can get caught into incremental processes of what seems feasible within the jargon, within the frameworks, within the references of a particular area of negotiation. And I want to invite us to stand back and say, we now know more. We know that we are destroying the life-supporting systems of our planet. We need to create governmental policies within nations and regions that are compatible with turning that around. And now we need to stand back and look at trade and ask ourselves, what kind of trading relationships between nations is compatible with life on a thriving planet? And let's not assume that we inherit the thinking, the jargon, the concepts from the past. We need to be bold in rethinking what thriving trade looks like, that respects lower income countries and recognizes the long history of power imbalance between nations in trade and starts to change that, because we don't thrive on one planet as 10 billion people with one region always dominating over another. We have to enable everyone to live in the donut. So I absolutely would welcome a transformative thinking on trade.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got another question, or someone's phoning in or not. Oh, here's a question. This is very small. Okay, right, I have to read this out and sound like a whatever. Kate spoke about the importance of the EU to expend its sight on the impact of production of goods outside the EU and importing into the EU. I totally agree this situation is already happening on the EU level as more environmental ambitious member states are making use of less ambitious Eastern European member states for goods production. Don't you think the EU should take a bottom-up approach in the way of resolving the issue? Thank you. And that's from Ingrid Schulz of Europe Direct, Bucharest.
So Ingrid, I'm not up on the details of the different member states and the positioning of production, so I can't comment specifically on that. But I think, of course, there's huge variation within the European member countries. And in fact, that was visible when I showed the 150 nations on the donut chart. You could see they were in quite different positions, some of them with far more social challenges than others. So, of course, there's a huge balancing conversation and adjustments within Europe as well as with the rest of the world. The reason I focused on that is because most countries, in fact, when they want to talk about greening, they want to talk about their own domestic production. And yet we know that huge volumes of consumption comes from overseas. And if we are taking a planetary perspective, then we have to take in our global consumption and our global ecological impact. It falls out of sight of governments so often, and it ends up offshoring the impacts. So, of course, there needs to be transformation within the relationships between countries within the EU, but we also need to make sure that the legislation and the targets take account of the global impacts of Europe. Otherwise, Europe preserves itself in a pristine state at the same time as running down the living planet in other nations. That makes no sense.
Okay, no, thanks very much. So the EU should not only be responsible domestically, but also shouldn't just rely on the policy, the legislation, and the safeguards in other countries, but actually keep its own. We should keep our own principles and standards even when engaging abroad. Okay, we've got a question here from Shailendra Singh. For developing countries, social indicator improvements delinked from business growth is indeed tough. Do you have some examples of where this has been done successfully? Furthermore, where is the finance to come from?
So let me check I understand the question. So social indicator improvements delinked from business growth. So first of all, you said developing countries. I'm not going to call them developing countries because I think we're all developing countries now. I'm guessing you're meaning lower income countries. So as you could see on the 150 nations that I showed, there were many countries, let's say Zambia, Bangladesh, India, that have massively falling short on meeting people's needs and have barely overshot any planetary boundaries. Those nations need what we call economic growth. For sure, they need to see an increase in their incomes so that they can invest in people's health and education and transport and housing and jobs and opportunity. So absolutely, we need growth in those nations. I just want to use my hosepipe here again, because I said the shape of growth is shown like this, but actually in nature things grow like this. Growth is an S curve. And lower income nations, I'm going to use my nose as a third finger, and lower income nations are coming up this curve and need economic growth, but need to do it in a way that has not been done before, because they can't do it with the same degenerative fossil fueled economies that high income nations have. The countries I'm talking about when I'm challenging the question on growth are the countries that are up here on the curve, that have had growth, have very high incomes compared to the rest of the world. They cannot expect to grow forever. They need to find ways to grow and then mature and have a post-growth economy that comes to thrive without depending upon endless growth. And that's a completely different kind of challenge. So those lower income countries that you were talking about, yes, they need growth and they need investment from companies that are respecting the fact that they cannot go to those nations and degenerate the landscapes in order to make their profits. They need to create regenerative designs and distributive designs. And that's why we need to transform business at the same time.
Okay, thanks very much. So that's basically well-being is possible in a post-growth world, and it's good to have the inspiration from the nature and the planet of growth, different growth systems. I think we've got a call in now for a question. I think is it coming through? Voila. Bernhard, over to you.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me? Good morning.
Hi.
I'm Brink from the EU Umweltbüro, and first of all, thank you very much, Kate, for this very inspirational start in the morning. As always, very much enjoying. And I have a follow-up question on, so you mentioned a term very often used is the decoupling, but another one is the regenerative economy, and we find it in the latest version of the environmental action program. And what do you see as a specific policy needs to encourage a regenerative economy? This would be my question to you.
Oh, great question. So I don't know what Europe means when it uses the word regenerative, because I see the phrase regenerative growth, and that makes me think someone's trying to take two paradigms and just really, really hopes that they look good when they sit next to each other. But it's not quite clear what they mean. So I would really like to hear Europe explain and give examples of regenerative growth. Regenerative design starts by recognizing that we live on a planet with cycles. And again, I can use the donut here. We have a carbon cycle. We have hydrological cycles of fresh water. And we need to find ways of working with and within the cycles of the living world. The air's ability to cleanse itself of pollutants, for example, and the cycles of life itself, the ability of a forest to regenerate, the ability of a shoal of fish to regenerate. So regenerative economies are economies that work with and within the cycles of the living world. They don't run down these cycles of life. They work within them. They harvest trees no faster than they grow. They harvest fish no faster than the shoal can replenish itself. It's a very different model from the extractive model of enterprise and industry that the 20th century was built upon. And so it means starting by recognizing that we have degenerated Earth's living systems, and we need to start by restoring them. We need to replenish the soils. We need to rewild much of the landscape. We need to sequester carbon in soil and in the landscape. So first, restore and replenish, and then sustain at a rate that is regenerative. And that's not how business has been done before. So it's a new vision of humanity coming home and belonging within the living world. And of course, I believe it needs to be, at the same time as being regenerative, it needs to be distributive, because another favorite toy, 20th century economies concentrated resources in few hands. We have major shareholding corporations that concentrate the value of company activity in the hands of its shareholders, who are a tiny fraction of all people. And actually we need, instead of centralizing design, we need distributive design that recognizes that life is a network, it's an ecosystem, and ecosystems thrive when resources are distributed equitably throughout them. And so we need to create economies that are far more distributive of opportunity and distributive of value. So for me, a regenerative and distributive economy has to be what brings us into the donut that meets the needs of all within the needs of the planet. Now, I would absolutely love to see examples of regenerative agriculture in Europe, agriculture that is sequestering carbon in the soil, examples of regenerative enterprises that are helping to create renewable energy systems and getting rid of fossil fuels, but also of regenerating communities and that are distributive of that value. That vision is, to me, the vision of what the future economy needs to look like. Let's make it real in Europe, and let's find examples of policies and companies and regions and cities that are making it happen. We're working at the Donut Economics Action Lab. We're working very closely with the city of Amsterdam, who've taken the concept of the donut and saying we're going to use this as a vision for the future of our city and our emergence from the COVID crisis. And because they've committed to having no fossil fuel transport in the city by 2030, 100% circular economy by 2050. They're replanning the spatial layout of the city around the design of the donut. They are embodying it at the heart of their city. And it's not easy. It's not easy to say we're going to become a regenerative place, but this is the 21st century journey that we have to go on.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think it's very interesting, the regenerative journey, and you underline that we need to work within context. And basically, in some areas, we've had a sort of ecosystem approach.
I would welcome a transformative thinking on trade.
Yeah. Anyway, so we've seen that an ecosystem-based approach is a good way forward, and nature restoration and nature-based solutions are good parts of the regenerative model. We had a poll in the beginning. I'd like to quickly share the poll, but to remind all of you what the questions were, we asked in the poll is, what do you think about the European Green Deal as it stands now? Does it bring about system change? Does it bring about important new strategies, action plans and laws, but not systemic change? Does it bring progress, but only a bit better than business as usual? Or are they have objectives that sound good on paper, but will not be realized? And the results we have at the moment is that the majority of people think the second one. It's important, has new strategies, action plans and laws, but is not yet a driver of systemic change. A few people did say it is. It does bring about, and a few other people on the other side said it's good on paper, but won't be realized. Okay, and some people think it's only a bit better than business as usual. So this is in some ways a challenge, which then creates a platform for future, this next speakers, is how can they address that? Because if you look on the tin, it does say system change. So how can we make sure what's in the tin is actually what's on the tin? And that's the big challenge. I don't know if you maybe wish to bring out a little bit more about your talks about harnessing and hijacking, because I thought that was interesting. You spent a long time on hijacking. Maybe we could have a couple of sentences on harnessing, because ultimately we want to realize all these opportunities. So what is the best way to basically harness the opportunities so that we get, when we do this questionnaire again, that we actually have a higher level?
Great. So I think the best way to harness the opportunity is when leaders just have the guts to go for it. They just say, despite my political intuition that tells me this is too daring, this is too bold, we're going to do it. We're going to actually make this legislation happen. We're going to put these plans into action. Because when you get to the other side of that decision, a clarity happens, that a new energy is released, and the new possibilities start to be made visible. So first of all, I think to harness that agenda, just let's have the guts to do this, because we know we've been trying for decades and decades. And like I said right at the beginning, sometimes a moment opens up a crack in history, and COVID creates that crack, and the climate crisis really creates that crack, and Fridays for Future marches create that crack. And if we don't jump on it and move with it, it's gone. So first of all, harness it by having the courage to move. Secondly, though, once you start moving finance in this direction, you unlock the possibilities of the new economy that's been waiting to be created. And that has all sorts of knock-on effects, positive knock-on effects that inspire others, create the new ecosystem. Things become possible. So it's much, much easier to show transformation once it begins, rather than to sit talking about it before it's begun. So just the earlier we start, the faster it will move, the more those positive co-benefits and knock-on effects come through. So, and then lastly, I do believe there is a genuine desire to harness and transform in so many people. The people I meet working in the Commission, the people who are very senior in the Commission, people in the NGO community, people in business, there are people desiring transformation everywhere, finding themselves, though, locked in systems and frameworks and silos and institutions and a language and a baggage and historical norms that hold us back. And there just are moments when you have to say, we are not going to be held by that. We want to be able to look back, whether in a decade or whether at the end of our own lives, and say, I was part of making a transformation that I knew the world needed. And we did it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're very coming close to the very end. I like the comment on courage. Maybe we've got time for one very last question. This is from Diego Marin. The energy transition will require billions of tons of raw materials and metals and minerals. How do we make sure we stay within planetary boundaries while simultaneously moving away from fossil fuels?
That's an excellent question, because there's a real danger that people think, oh, I'll just get rid of my fossil fuel car and get an electric car and all will be well in the world. When actually, as this question says, it requires materials and metals and lithium and mining and all sorts of issues. So yes, that energy transition requires new metals and materials and mining, and that needs to be done with a very, very strong eye on social justice around those communities that live where those lithium mines are and are suddenly finding themselves at the center of the world's attention. We also need to ensure we bring circularity in so that we don't have this linear stream of material, but begin to use and reuse the materials and metals from the past. But also, of course, we need to power down the excessive energy demand that so many households and communities and cities and nations already have. So it's not just saying our demands are as they are, let's just substitute them with a different way of meeting their energy needs. We need to transform how we travel, how we eat, how we heat our homes. We need to reduce our impact on this planet so that we have the chance of living within those planetary boundaries.
Okay, thank you very, very much. We're now coming to the close. I think that was fascinating. And I think that we'll look again at the reports, the paper we've done looking at the Green Deal, what it's done and what it needs to do. And in light of that conversation, we'll sort of look again at what we have in terms of the way forward. There's a lot of terms and issues that you've raised. The just transition is, of course, core to what we do, but your redistributive value linked with regenerative economy was particularly interesting. The dangers of hijacking versus harnessing, and that we're basically in a moment in history where we need to turn the corner. And I liked what you said in the end. It's not just about having the guts, but it's also once it starts happening, once the finance starts flowing, you actually get a positive feedback loop. People see the success, people engage with other people who can historically were separate, but we can work together, and maybe we can move towards making sure that the Green Deal is not just a semantic change, but basically a true system change. So thank you very, very much for that, Kate. I thought that was brilliant. And now hopefully all the audience will have thought it's brilliant. And for those who haven't seen it, we're recording this so that you can admire the discussion afterwards. So now I'd just like to close this session, if I can find the right piece of paper, which I can't find.
Well, I'll say, while you're looking for it, I'll say thank you. It's a real pleasure to join you. As I said, as a UK citizen now on the outside of this process and really regretting my country not being one of the red dots in the graph that I showed. I really look to Europe for that leadership and really admire and want to salute the leadership that a region of countries with many differences between them can show and can move the world, and keep doing it.
Okay, thank you very much. That was excellent. So just now we're gonna have a questions and answer session for the Commissioner is open, as well as the survey questions. So the next session will be with Virginijus Sinkevicius, the Commissioner, discussing with Jeremy Waits, our Secretary General. There should be, if you look on the home space, you should find a second poll looking at what you find as the most promising elements of the European Green Deal. What do you find that really offers hope that it's systemic change rather than semantic change? And also there's, yes, and you'll start putting in your questions now, because what we do is we gather all the questions, the ones with the most likes and so on, we then take forward for the next moderator. And now we'll have a small break of 15 minutes, so please start again at exactly 10:15 and prepare your questions and your poll answers in the meantime. And for the moment, thank you very much. And again, a great, huge thanks to Kate. I thought that was very, very interesting. And maybe we'll put the donut in the Green Deal. Okay.
Thanks very much for having me in part of the day.